Hello and welcome to a short presentation summing up my doctoral thesis. My name is Philip Bonnaire, and our work dealt with high-frequency thermoacoustics induced by a reacting jet in crossflow. To give you a short idea of the exact topic, which is placed in the broad field of thermoacoustics, I will give you a short introduction. So imagine you have a combustion chamber. It's a confined geometry, maybe you have a sweller unit, and the flame stabilizes because it finds its thermal and hydrodynamic balance somewhere in the combustion chamber. So far, so good. But as soon as we have an unsteady flame with unsteady heat release, this kind of flames can emit acoustic waves. These acoustic waves can travel to the acoustic boundary conditions, can be reflected, and in turn, those acoustic waves can excite the flame. And voila, we have a thermoacoustic feedback loop. What's the reaction? Thermoacoustics is often accompanied by large pressure fluctuations, and we want to avoid those large pressure fluctuations because they can damage the combustion chamber. So what do? First, we try to model those thermoacoustic instabilities. How do we do that? We tried to extract the flame from this very complex framework. So we are left with an acoustic model and a flame model. Why do we do that? First, the acoustic model can be computed super easily. It's just a Helmholtz equation with a source term on the right-hand side. And the flame model actually gives us the solution to that source term. So we feed the acoustic quantities to the flame model. The flame model, in a very classical sense, relates velocity fluctuations measured at a reference position, for example, at the burner plate. The flame model links those velocity fluctuations to heat release fluctuations. Those heat release fluctuations then deliver the closure for the acoustic equations. But what do we do if we deal with high-frequency thermoacoustics, transverse modes, plenty of jet flames, and a reacting jet in crossflow? We actually don't know what the flame models is, or what kind of flame models we can propose. But even before having an idea of the flame model, we have to do another step. The first step is that we have to understand the feedback mechanisms between flame, flow, and acoustics. This is step one. As soon as we have an idea of those three things, we can create flame models and hopefully then also solve the acoustic equations by delivering a source term, or basically a closure for those acoustic models. So this gave me a job over the last 5 years, determining the thermoacoustic feedback mechanisms of flame, flow, and acoustics for a combustion chamber with a reacting jet in crossflow. To give you a broad idea what kind of publications are the basis of this thesis, first of all, we dealt with a generic geometry. This generic geometry was easy to compute with large cavity simulations, so I consider it to be the playground of our research. Given the generic geometry, it led to 2 publications. One of them was presented at ASME 2023 in Boston, and the second one at the SOTIC in Zurich. Luckily, the German Aerospace Center provided us with experimental data of a combustion chamber, which is super close to what we've called our generic geometry. This is what I call the real geometry. So it's existing, and the German Aerospace Center provided us with the experimental data. Given that, we could form another publication, which was then published in Combustion and Flame. The fourth contribution, a collaboration with the University of Duisburg-Essen. I won't talk about this in this particular talk today, but whoever is interested can also find it online. So let's dive in. First, in order to have the chance to study thermoacoustic interactions, we basically have to observe them in our combustion chamber. And at first hand, it was super hard to produce those high-frequency thermoacoustic instabilities. So everything we tried, for example, mass flow fluctuations at the inlet, we played around with the reflection coefficient of the boundaries. Nothing helped. But then there was one solution, and this was ramping up the power density. So first of all, we had stable conditions, around about 200 kilowatts. And then we ramped it up to 800 kilowatts just by increasing the mass flow rate and also increasing the equivalence ratio. And then we had nice thermoacoustic instabilities. I have to admit that we put the power density out of a window which we call of industrial relevance. So this is important to notice. But then what did we observe? One thing caught our attention, and this was the shear layer instability that was accompanied by these thermoacoustic instabilities. So on the left-hand side, we see the vortex structures of a jet in crossflow. So jet velocity from the bottom, crossflow velocity from the left. And we quickly noticed that the shear layer vortices are those which are quite very present in this pressure spectra that we can see here on the right in this tiny window and here in this more enlarged view. So we were wondering, in case this shear layer interaction is part of the thermoacoustic feedback loop, how can we manipulate the shear layer but not changing the operating point? And then we came up with the idea of using different shapes of the mixing tube. But first of all, I have to draw attention again to this power density scale. So in order to put it back into industrial relevance, we increase the mass flow rate a bit so that we are again in this window. So it's not the same operating point as I showed on the slides before. But what did we observe? For an wing-shaped mixing tube, so cross-flow velocity from the left, a wing-shaped mixing tube produced thermoacoustic instabilities round about 5,000 Hertz. The circular shape was completely quiet, and the egg-shaped mixing tube produced a thermoacoustic instability around about 11,000 Hertz. And for those two cases where we observed thermoacoustic instabilities, we could also observe that the flame, so in particular the heat release, the global heat release, the flow, the hydrodynamics, so for example, velocity fluctuations and also vorticity fluctuations, and the acoustics always had same peaks, or always had peaks at the same frequency. And also the reviewers of this paper, they said it's a bit more descriptive. Can you give an idea of the true mechanisms, the true underlying mechanisms? And this is what we drive for in the publication that we presented at the SOTIC in Zurich. So we looked up for a kind of hypothesis that we can frame the ideas of our work. Luckily, Santosh Hemchandra in 2018 already published an idea, and given his idea, the hydrodynamics can participate in the thermoacoustic feedback loop in two ways. First, as amplifier. This is what we call the loop 1. So in the top field, we see the interaction between flame and acoustics, already presented on the preceding slides. And in case the hydrodynamics acts as an amplifier, the acoustics triggers hydrodynamics, and then hydrodynamics can basically affect the flame. And there's also loop number 2, where the hydrodynamics is actually the driver of the thermoacoustic instability. And this is in case we have a hydrodynamic instability. This instability is strong enough to have an impact on the flame, and then the feedback loop between flame and acoustics can occur. I want to discuss the findings, or I want to discuss the findings of the work that we presented at SOTIC in Zurich from a more macroscopic view. First, what did we observe? Changing the hydrodynamic spectrum modified the acoustic spectrum. This is something that we observed. So first, one of those two arrows highlighted in red have to play an important role. Then, second thing that we observed is that we never observed a hydrodynamic peak without a corresponding peak in the acoustic spectrum. So given our observations, we never saw a loop 2 category instability. Every time, or every instability, every hydrodynamic and every thermoacoustic instability that we observed can be linked to a loop 1 instability. So also the result of this paper showed that we have indications that the hydrodynamics can actually affect the thermoacoustic stability, but given the results that we published in this paper, it still remains unclear what the exact mechanisms are. But luckily, we had one more shot, and this was the real geometry. So we observed, or we obtained the data from the German Aerospace Center. Here, I can admit that the experimental data matched quite well with the large eddy simulation that we produced. So luckily, the models we used were valid. I won't talk more about this in this short presentation, so whoever is interested can look it up in the paper. So I quickly want to introduce the test rig. So we had 12 injectors at the front plate, and then 3 reacting jet in crossflows. We had, in the experimental setup, we had technical premixing in the first stage and also in the second stage. And in initial studies, we identified that equivalence ratio fluctuations are a strong driver. Therefore, we thought, why not trying to mitigate those instabilities that we observed in the large eddy simulation and which was also observed in the experimental setup by just injecting a perfectly premixed mixture in the second stage. And this is what we did. Since this sometimes leads to confusion, I want to highlight that for the one case where we had a technical premixing in the first stage and a technical premixing in the second stage, we had experimental data available. For the second case, where we injected a perfectly premixed mixture in the second stage, this is just a numerical test. And what we expected is that the instability, which was around about 2000 Hertz, will decrease because we basically take the feedback loop of equivalence ratio fluctuations. But what we observed was something different. So the first longitudinal mode, which was present in the experiments, was also present in a large eddy simulation. But the second case, where we just injected a perfectly premixed mixture in the second stage, still showed thermoacoustic instability, but at much higher frequency, around about 5000 Hertz. And as you can see on the right hand side here, it was a transverse longitudinal mixed mode. So then we had a look on the flame dynamics. On the left hand side, you can see that reacting jet. So we actually have a look at this window here. The reacting jet was bending with the acoustic velocity, with the axial acoustic velocity. So more or less it followed that kind of velocity fluctuation. And on the right hand side, we again observed that there is a strong shear layer instability. And there we recalled that we have already seen this in this presentation in slide number 13. Also for the generic geometry, we observed strong shear layer instability, but we could not basically close the hypothesis what's the true reason why shear layer instability is present when there's a strong thermoacoustic instability. And we could also not determine in this case how the shear layer is part of the feedback loop. So to put this further, we wanted to answer that question. First, our next studies that we introduced were we have the global heat release rate, and we have different influential parameters of the global heat release rate. For example, we have the unburned density, we have the heat of reaction, the flame speed, and also the flame surface. And all of those quantities are now identified on isosurfaces, except the unburned density. This is taken somewhere in the mixing tube. We take the fluctuations, normalize them by its mean, and then we transfer those quantities into frequency domain. In frequency domain, we also have the advantage to get an idea of the phase lags between those quantities. And hence, we can see which quantity contributes to the global heat release rate. And here's what we observed. For the first case with the technical premixing, where the flame actually follows the acoustic velocity, we see again first that equivalence ratio fluctuations are in phase with global heat release fluctuations. The flame speed, also a strong influential parameter for global heat release rate, but also the flame surface. So with this axial velocity, we have a strong modulation in flame surface, which also in this case drives the instability. For the second case, we actually also expected that the flame surface will be in phase with the global heat release rate, because all those tiny vortices, we expected them to create flame surface in phase, but actually they do not. So flame surface, the green arrow, is actually it's definitely not in phase with the global heat release rate. Also the flame speed, and as expected, the equivalence ratio, there is none because we suppressed them. So just the density fluctuations are in phase with global heat release rate. And density modulations are directly linked to pressure fluctuations in the isentropic framework. So let's sum up what we observed within those studies. First, we could show that with the jet aspect ratio, we could change the acoustic spectrum. So in one line, the jet aspect ratio can determine the stability of the combustor. Then, secondly, on the right-hand side, so far we only had cases where the hydrodynamics amplifies the acoustics. So we never observed the hydrodynamic instability on its own, which could be an influential parameter for the flame. And now, jumping back to slide number 10, where I showed first we have to understand the feedback mechanisms, and then we can propose models. So what kind of models can we propose? First, for the longitudinal mode, we saw that the flame surface modulations drive the instability. So the acoustic velocity fluctuations, which are in line with the axis, drive the instability. So we call them the orthogonal velocity fluctuations because they are orthogonal to the axis of the reacting jet. And also still the equivalence ratio fluctuations are a strong driver of those instabilities that we observed in this case. For the perfectly premixing, we did not observe flame surface to be in phase. So there's only one parameter which is in phase with the global heat release, and this is the unburned density. And as already mentioned, the density is directly linked to pressure fluctuations. So we have a compression and expansion of the gases which drive the instability. So we can directly propose a model which links pressure fluctuations to heat release fluctuations. With that being said, I'm at the end of the presentation, and I invite you to have a look in the thesis, which will be published at the university's server. Thank you.